This Excel lesson is dedicated to wrapping up this commission tool. So the objective today is to create this tool from scratch. Now I mentioned this before, but this tool really just consists of two Excel formulas, the SUMIFs and the pivot table. So you're going to be on your own for the SUMIFs for the most part. We're talking about this summary tab here. Now by this time you should be pretty familiar with the formula, so what I'm going to do is provide you with another cheat sheet that maps out our restrictions, but we won't be going over it in much detail because what I want this video's focus to be on is the pivot table. Because by this time, I think you're pretty familiar with interfacing with it. I mean, you've been able to use it to help me track the discrepancies and save me money, but how exactly is this created? Or even more importantly, what is the pivot table's purpose? Now, if you were to ask me what the most transferable or relevant Excel tool there is out there, it would be the pivot table, because this pivot table allows you to effortlessly reorganize and summarize raw data in a way where you can easily analyze and make sense of it. And this kind of feature here is needed and required in any company from any industry. So in this case, the pivot table allowed us to very quickly compare our reservations from two databases, right? And this pivot table is especially important for companies with really big data sets. So companies with data sets like this that we have here, but it comes in hundreds of thousands of line items. Now, before we go straight into it, the best approach to succeed in creating it is to first envision our end product. We need to have the end goal in mind before we even start. So you guys already know how the table looks like, so you're cheating a little bit, but let's go over our specifications. We need to first ask, what parts of the data set do we even care about? So let's start with this actual database, Expedia's database. Now in the first video when I introduced you to distribution channels, you learned that the goal was to pinpoint reservations that were actually no-shows or early departures. So what do we care about? Well, first and foremost, the reservation name is important, right? Or else how do we know which one is the problem reservation when you reconcile it? Now, two other obvious specifications are the checkout dates right here and the reservation statuses. The checkout dates help us capture the early departure cases, and the status case helps us capture no-shows. Now, the last piece of data that we care about is what you learned from the most recent lesson. This column, the Who Collects column. Because remember, we have two types, right? We have our net rates, the shady way, and I call it the shady way because Expedia is collecting the commission right off the bat, right? So when you see Expedia in these different rows here by these reservations, Expedia has already taken that commission and made the rates a lot lower than what the guest actually paid for. So these reservations that indicate Expedia are net rates. But now we don't really care about these reservations because the commission has already been collected by Expedia. What we care about are the hotel collect reservations. So the example of Big Brother, right, where Expedia collects commission at the end of the month. And we need to focus on these hotel collect reservations because these are the reservations that Expedia is going to look at the end of the month when they charge us. So we need to make sure that they're doing it right. We need to make sure that they're not charging us for those no-shows and early departures. So now you know what's up. And now we can create the pivot table. So I'm going to go to Data in the menu and then click Pivot Table. Now keep in mind that this is on a Mac, but it should be pretty straightforward as to where to find this feature. And if you notice, once I click Pivot Table, our whole data set is automatically selected. And usually it does this conveniently, but I would say you should make it a common practice to always verify that it indeed is capturing the data. So because it's from column B to J, we are good to go. Now, even though the pivot table is super powerful and super useful, the great thing about it is that it's so easy to use. So this isn't rocket science, folks. You see which label corresponds to which area in the table. So, it's so intuitive. You'd probably be able to create this without me showing you this video. I would say the first step is to always start at the row labels, and it would make sense to place our guest at the row label. So you would just drag it in. And the thing about the pivot table, really the way to do it, really the way to create it is to kind of just play with it. So watch. If I put guest anywhere else, so I'm kind of experimenting here, it wouldn't really make sense, right? None of this really looks right. It's kind of hard to work with. Okay, so now let's circle back to our end goal here. What are we trying to accomplish? We want to quickly navigate through all of our reservations here by status and dates, right? So we want to be able to filter through them. So that gives us the hint to somehow work with this filter label around here. So what I'm going to do is drag our departure dates and status to the report filter. So now when we start designating the dates, it captures what we care about, because we're trying to pinpoint reservations that are still booked on Expedia. So this should always be filtered as booked. Now we can't also forget about our hotel collect specifications, right? Kind of to my point earlier on, I made the point that we only care about reservations where Expedia looks at and uses to charge us at the end of the month. And so this should always be filtered as hotel collect. So the dates range, the dates here is really the only thing that is dynamic, and you already know this because you're the one that's filtering through the dates as you look for those discrepancies. And this is basically it. We've basically created the kind of pivot table that would work with us. Again, it's super simple. Now I'm going to have you create the pivot tables for the PMS as well, and it's the same idea, but keep in mind that the PMS database won't have a quote-unquote who collects column like it does here in Expedia. So instead, what we need to do is go off of the rate plans, but I'm sure you have an idea of how this works because you use the rate plans to create the if formulas. And again, the rate plans tell us what kind of reservation it is. If it's the hotel collect reservation or if it's the net rate reservation. So our hotel collect rate plans are SOEP, SR3P, and SR5P. And it's going to be the same idea where you would put the rate plans in the report filter area and filter only those 3 rate plans. Now, to be quite honest with you, I'm not really showing you the pivot table in its glory because we haven't even touched either of these 2 sections, the column labels and the values. And these really aren't necessary for the sake of tracking these discrepancies. What we're doing here is a little bit simpler. But just for your learning purposes, I want to show you how the pivot table really is so powerful. So I'm going to reset this, and I'm going to pose a new question. Let's say I want to determine the breakdown by number of reservations between net rates and hotel collect. So now instead of having guests in the row labels, let's put dates. And this is really cool because notice how in the data set there are duplicates, right? We have multiple reservations from this date, multiple reservations from that date, but on the pivot table, it makes sure that it's only the unique values. Now logically, if we want to see the breakdown of net rates and hotel collect, we want those labels to be here, right? Again, you always want to envision how this table would look like. So in the column area, we can just drag the who collects field name over here. You might see only hotel collect, but it's because it's not selected. And finally, when you're trying to determine the breakdown by number of reservations, what are we counting when we look at the database, right? So if we want to find out the breakdown between our net rate reservations and our hotel collect reservations by these dates here, what's being counted? Well, what's being counted is the number of reservations, right? So we would drag guest to the values label. And as you can see, everything is mapped out now so clearly and simply. Immediately, you're able to see the number of hotel collect and net rate reservations by dates. And the power of the pivot table really is this value area. So in this scenario, we're counting the number of reservations that are from this column, so that are hotel collect and that are net rates, and it's broken down by these dates. But what the pivot table is able to do is more than just count. So if I click this button here, we have so many more options. If you notice, we can also add amounts. And this brings us to our challenge for this lesson. Now, you're going to hate me, but when you calculated revenue earned by date, so this goes back to way early on when we talked about the financial management cycle. Lesson 1, when you use the sum ifs to, determine that revenue earned, what you did was actually inefficient. I mean, you were able to automate it, which is great, but if you had used this tool, the pivot table, you would have been able to calculate it in less than 2 minutes. So your challenge for this lesson is to apply what you just learned in this video. So creating a pivot table, and I want you to apply it to our very first lesson way in the beginning, where we needed to convert raw accounting data to useful accounting information, my revenue earned. So the assignment is to determine the breakdown for the total amount of revenue earned by this date range, July 1st to August 10th, using a pivot table. But I don't want you to just stop there. I also want you to use the same pivot table to also help me figure out my Visa, my MasterCard, my American Express, and my cash payments. So play around with it, but really, if you just follow this structure I laid out, it should take you no more than 5 minutes. And that basically concludes our lesson. So at this point in the program, I've taught you all of the basic Excel formulas and tools that you really need to know. I mean, I'll be introducing you to a little bit more stuff, but the focus now really is going to be on giving you more opportunities to practice and master each one. So from here on out, there's going to be less hand-holding because you basically are now equipped with knowledge to succeed and just be proficient in this platform. So stay tuned.